Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues now. And make sure to stay tuned to catch me, Mike Gallagher, coming up at 9, only on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning, Kristen McQuarrie of Trib Ed Board. And Kristen, we still have a school funding impasse in Illinois. The governor this week, Governor Rauner, calling on the Senate to send him the bill they passed so that he can mandatorily veto it and send it back and we can move this along. Is the governor right to demand the bill that's been passed be put on his desk?
Yeah. Yes, you should.
So why hasn't it been?
Well, I mean, initially they were trying to let things calm down. They knew he was probably going to veto it outright, so they were hanging on to it. Now I think they're trying to push the crisis and trying to, raise the ante of the possibility of schools not opening because it is tied to all school funding. This reform bill, they kind of slipped this language in. So schools won't open if he doesn't sign this bill, address it in some way, send it back to the legislature, and the clock's ticking. So now it's a matter of kind of brinkmanship, in my opinion.
Well, and the substance of this, so here's what Governor Rauner, we've talked to him on this show earlier in the week, essentially suggested is that he's opposed to a CPS bailout, and it's not just kind of a one-time CPS bailout, a one-time $215 million payment for CPS's, the flailing teachers' pension fund. It's also really locking in the suburbs to finance CPS a few different ways over the long term. That's really what the deal is, and that's why you have Democrats digging in, because the language that the governor is essentially indicating he is going to use in his amendatory veto is language from a Republican state senator's legislation. His name is Jason Barrickman. He's from Champaign, which would provide $165 million in additional general state aid to CPS. So is this just a $50 million difference of opinion in terms of what CPS should get? No, it's more than that. It's much more than that, which is why you have Democrats digging in. And we dug into this in one of the newspapers I started, ChicagoCityWire.com. And we find the nature of the language in the 482-page Senate Bill 1 would in effect distribute responsibility for paying off the $17 billion in debt that CPS has accrued across the rest of the state, with particular onus on the suburbs because that's where the people are and that's where most of the money is. That's really what's happening. Remember, CPS spends $17,266 per pupil. That's according to the Illinois State Board of Education. The state average per pupil spending, $12,821. So you've got a $5,000 difference per pupil, or CPS spending nearly 50% more than the state average per pupil, and yet they're complaining about money because it's all for the kids. Is it all for the kids, Kristen?
Look,
is it?
I think you have to get past the issue of CPS with this bill and look at the bigger picture. I agree with Rauner's assessment that 90% of the bill is good, and actually 250 districts get more per pupil funding under this formula than CPS. And when you talk about the suburbs bailing out CPS, what suburbs are you talking about? Lansing, Calumet City? Because this
actually,
no, let me finish.
Yeah,
let me finish.
That's true.
This formula is based on state income tax money that we all send to Springfield. This doesn't touch your local property tax revenue. This is not taking local property tax revenue from Wheaton and giving it to Chicago. We send all of our money to Springfield. And in my opinion, it is the role of government to distribute that money based on need. That is a conservative principle. And there are downstate schools that have been absolutely starved under the current state formula. It's not working. We know that. We have the largest gap between what property wealthy and low-income districts spend in the nation. So we are a huge outlier here. And this formula works to adjust that. And also, you're never going to bail out CPS. CPS is on the brink of bankruptcy. No amount of money that Springfield could send to CPS will save it.
And so, but we should spend more anyway.
A couple of the provisions in the bill simply bring CPS in line with what every other district gets in the state. Pension help?
Yeah, okay. So here's the deal. Number one, of Fort Heights, which is one of America's poorest communities, is treated as wealthier than Chicago with respect to the state aid, the school funding formula. Okay,
I know and that's a provision of the bill that I don't like. But again, because there are three key ways that CPS gets help under this bill, and that is the one. The bill treats Chicago as it bumps it up into this higher tier so that it gets more money and makes it look poorer than it is. I don't like that part of the bill. The governor could mandatorily veto that part of the bill, but I don't think we throw out what is the only serious look at the state funding formula, which has been broken for 25 years, that we throw it all out because of this. And if you want to start digging, if the issue is you don't like the way CPS spends money and it's all the bureaucracy and the outcomes and all that, that's fine. But
I also don't like spending more money on school districts with declining enrollment, which we're not doing just in Chicago. We're doing across the state. I don't like the school funding formula at all. I'm a leading voice and have been for decades on changing the school funding formula. It's unknowable, so it's not so it's by definition capricious, and it's redistributive, and it rewards bad behavior, and it rewards shrinking school districts. It's absurd on multiple levels, but so is pouring more money into these systems and obsessing about per pupil expenditures in terms of equalizing them. Do we care about research? Do we care about what we know about how children learn?
Do you think money...
I'm not done. Or do we just care about financing $70,000, really $2 million pensions for CPS teachers? Because that's what
about the pensions for the suburban teachers?
That too.
What about how
that too?
Should the magnifying glass also be over suburban districts? You think that
of course
CPS, of course, gets the most attention, but you think those wealthy suburban districts that you're trying to protect are being great stewards of tax dollars? Have you looked at those superintendents' contracts? Have you looked at how much? I know your outlets have looked at how much money CPS spends on fast food and lunches and all that. And I love that, and that's great, and it's great coverage. The suburban schools don't get the same microscope because they're not in the same financial straits. They are sitting on piles of money in some of these districts, and they're not getting the same sort of scrutiny, but they're also getting state aid.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Number one, if you look at the property tax reports that we've done on all three regions of Chicago, we broke it out in thirds, and all of the collar counties, you will find that we also looked at all the school district spend, and we looked at school district spend in the context of enrollment and what's enrollment doing versus what's spend doing. So we actually have raised these issues. I've raised these issues. I have said for years and years and years into a vacuum that there are a lot of suburban school districts living off past reputations that do not reflect current reality in terms of the product. I'm the one who runs around reminding people that 2/3 of school children in this state, 2.1 million kids in K-12, in the 4th grade level and at 8th grade, neither grade levels do 2/3 of the students in our public school system read or do math at grade level. 2/3. So that's obviously well beyond just the city of Chicago. City of Chicago just happens to be one of the worst examples. But here's the play, and I want to get just one other issue, and then I'll let you respond. We'll take some calls. 312-642-5600, turnkey.pro answer line. The robbing of the suburbs, the redistribution of suburbs to failing centrally planned Politburo-style systems like CPS. You could say, well, it's our tax dollars. It's not property tax dollars that we're taking from Park Ridge or Wheaton to send to Chicago. Of course it is, because money's fungible. And so you send my general state aid to Chicago, and so what happens locally? Property taxes to go up to make for the difference in the general state aid that we lost.
And many times, Dan, that's a choice. I understand
Agreed.
that your suburban listeners are out there. They have gargantuan property tax bills. And yes, part of that is because the state has slipped in what it owes school districts. We are no longer funding the primary source of education. But I would argue in a lot of those districts, that is those residents' choice. They want to have a premier education. At New Trier, they want their kids to be $23,000 per kid to be spent on education and to have this campus-like experience for their kids and 67 different choices for extracurricular activities. That's their choice. We don't need to spend $23,000 per kid on New Trier.
Do we need to spend 17 at CPS?
No, we don't. But I would argue, and I think this is something that you don't address or don't agree with, but money at some point does provide better resources for kids.
Actually, it doesn't.
Listen.
It does not. Here's the research. Here's the research. No. Here's the research. Number one, the entire formula and the entire way we do talk about schools in this state is inputs, not outcomes. So that's just a completely wrong conversation. Number two, the research is clear that at a certain minimum threshold, which we are way above, it is about household income, not per pupil spend. Household income is a lot more, is a correlative value than talking about per pupil spend. That's the research, and this is not unclear.
No, I agree with you, but that is true. There is also research to suggest that when school districts have more money to spend, they can hire better teachers. They attract better teachers. I have a friend who had a special ed kid in the south suburbs, and when she went to the IEP to sit down, they had some interventionists. They had people like 3 people sitting around a table trying to figure out what they could do to help this child. They moved to Wilmette. They show up at their first meeting. They're sitting around a table with 15 people who were ready to intervene and help this child.
You don't need it. And you don't need what Wilmette has.
I'm just saying that's
overkill.
That's what's being offered.
And I understand. I understand that. But teachers, good teachers, generally speaking, are not leaving K through 12 education because they're not being undercompensated. They're leaving because they're in systems that don't allow them to be good teachers, to allow them to do what they wanted to do, which is to instill a love of learning into children. I'm an advocate for teachers. I wouldn't have my phony baloney job on the radio if I didn't have great teachers growing up. Nobody is opposed to great teachers, supporting great teachers, compensating great teachers. Chicago public school teachers make more lifetime earnings than any teachers in the country, including New York, not adjusted for cost of living, with New York being a third higher cost of living than Chicago. This is not about compensation. This is about system. This is about a conversation that is all system focused, prop up a system that everybody agrees doesn't work, focus on inputs, even though, and to the exclusion of outcomes, which you would logically say makes no sense, but we're just going to keep doing it and funneling more of other people's money into this system and into this conversation. Well, what sense does that make? How is that improving outcomes for children?
Then? I mean, what do you want to do? School districts should consolidate. There should be a long list of things that probably happened before SB 1, but they're not going to. They're not going to happen. And I've been in these downstate school districts that have absolutely no property wealth, and they suffer under this formula. It's not working anymore.
Right.
Districts.
I want to get rid of it.
Even suburban districts.
I want to get rid of it.
Well, even this completely refashions it. Even these suburban districts have learned to game the system. No, they don't get a lot out of general state aid, but they get tons of money in categoricals and other grant funding. And so it needs to be. That's what this does.
That's what happens in a kleptocracy. Everybody games the system. I'm not saying anybody comes to the table with clean hands, because the system is corrupt, because it's a banana republic, because everything we do in Illinois is a Ponzi scheme. You want to say, what should we do? I'll cede my time to a Prager University video featuring a young woman named Denisha Merriweather. Listen to what Denisha has to say, because what she's talking about is actually also part of what's been proposed as part of SB 1.
Public schools aren't the answer for everyone. They weren't the answer for me. Schools in my neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, function less as places of learning and more as warehouses to keep kids off the street. I know. I was one of those kids. I don't blame teachers or parents. I'm not interested in blaming anybody. I'm only interested in making things better. And the only way to do that is to give parents and students a choice. If a student can't get the education they need at their public school, there has to be an alternative. Thankfully, there was for me. My early years in my Jacksonville school were not a success, to put it mildly. I seldom understood the lesson. I was often confused and frustrated. I asked my teachers questions, but it seemed to me that this just annoyed them. So I stopped asking questions, and I withdrew into myself. I failed third grade twice. Fourth and fifth weren't much better. I lashed out by getting into fights with my classmates. D's and F's filled my report card. I was going nowhere. I was just another black kid in the warehouse. But fortunately for me, my life changed the summer before sixth grade. I went to live with my godmother. She had one overriding thought, to get me into a better school. A good education, she knew, was the only way to get out of the hole I had dug myself into. She didn't have any more money than my family did, but she had a plan. That was worth a lot. She knew about another school, a private school. Using a tax credit scholarship, you can call it a voucher, she enrolled me at Esprit de Corps Center for Learning. Esprit demands excellence from its students. It teaches them to be warriors for knowledge and for good values. The teachers at Esprit were invested in my success. They took the time to figure out why learning was so difficult for me, and they tailored their instruction to my learning style. Sound elite? It is. Sound expensive? It's not. In fact, Esprit spends less money per student than the public school I had attended. Instead of dreading my classes, I began to look forward to them. Instead of fistfights, I began doing community service work. I even earned the National Police Athletic League's Girl of the Year award in 2009.
Yeah. And the reason that's relevant is because, if you've listened to the show, I asked Governor Rauner about it when we had him on the show. I've asked Mark Batnick, state rep from Plainfield, about this. There is a tax credit proposal that would create a fund, voluntary contributions that would fund scholarships, just like Denisha Merriweather is talking about in Jacksonville, Florida. And this should also be included in whatever the governor does in terms of an amendatory veto, and should also be something you contact your legislators about, because part of talking about K through 12 reform, part of it is talking about increased competition.
I don't disagree with that. You know, I'm one of the biggest school choice advocates out there.
Yes.
Have you seen anyone leading on school choice in Illinois? So we're going to hold up. You're conflating these issues.
No, I'm not.
We need to address.
I'm not conflating them. I am not conflating them at all. This is part of the discussion right now. And you talk, the governor acknowledges it. The legislators acknowledge it. So if they don't do it, they should be held accountable. This isn't conflating it. I'm talking about kids. I'm talking about individual kids. I'm as concerned about Denisha Merriweather. Frankly, I'm more concerned about Denisha Merriweather than I am about the system and the superintendents and the teachers' unions and all the adults in the system.
So you would support SB 1 if it included starting the Opportunity Scholarship program? What are you saying?
I'm saying that right now, here's what the option we have, and I think this is the option the governor's going to pursue, and he should, to gut SB 1 and to put Barrickman's language in there, which is not as much of a bailout for Chicago, and it doesn't bind us to $17 billion in debt that CPS has accrued, number one, and number two, to make sure it's included, because, oh, by the way, all of the legislative leaders have signed off on this tax credit as well. They've all made public commitments and private commitments that they're on board for this. And to make sure that language is included, so you start to at least distribute some life preservers to some of the kids drowning in these terrible school districts.
I'm just telling you that I have watched school choice go backwards in Illinois.
I know, that's
for
why
10 years.
Why I'm raising the issue.
Well, I mean, is there even a bill on his desk? Are they going to call legislators back? They don't even come back until November.
There's language that has been agreed to that is to be incorporated in the final legislation.
Well, I will applaud that if it happens.
And if it's not, it will be included in the governor's amendatory veto. And if it's not, then he should be held accountable.